do you know about the book of Revelation? The rapture? Tribulation? The end times? The mark of the beast? The four horsemen of the apocalypse? The battle of Armageddon? A ticking clock. Wait a minute. Is that the whole story? This summer, we are going to look at the book of Revelation. We're going to study the book as a whole, from initial warning to final blessings. We're going to look at what it meant to the people of the first century, and we're going to look to see what this book says to us today. We will sing our way through Revelation, looking at all the songs and hymns that have been based on Revelation. The book of Revelation has really scary symbols in it. But yet, through all of these symbols, through all the scenes of war and destruction, we ultimately find God's faithfulness. Through the worst of times, God is faithful. Join us for worship this summer as we study the book of Revelation. We have been studying the book of Revelation, and this is our 7th and final week in the book of Revelation. So I invite you to stand as I share one of the final passages, one of the final visions in the book of Revelation, from Revelation chapter 21. Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and the sea was no more. And I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride, adorned for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, "See, the home of God is among mortals. He will dwell with them. They will be his people, and God himself will be with them. He will wipe every tear from their eyes. Death will be no more. Mourning and crying and pain will be no more, for the first things have passed away." Then the one who was seated on the throne said, "See, I am making all things new." Also he said, "Write this, for these words are trustworthy and true." Then he said to me, "It is done. I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. To the thirsty I will give water as a gift from the spring of the water of life. Those who conquer will inherit these things, and I will be their God, and they will be my children. But as for the cowardly and the faithless, for the polluted, for the murderers, the fornicators, the sorcerers, the idolaters, and all liars, their place will be in the lake that burns with fire and sulfur, which is the second death." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. You may be seated. So I showed that video again that we showed during the very first week of our Revelation teaching series, just to see how far we've come. And I wonder if your impressions of this last book of the Bible have changed if you have been able to join us either online or in person for any of these sermons on Revelation. I think that as we went through this video, we have seen a lot of the images that were talked about in that video. One thing that we didn't talk about was the rapture. And that's because the word rapture never appears in Revelation, and it never appears in the Bible, so we didn't talk about it. One of the passages that lead up to the vision that I shared with you was a passage about the battle of Armageddon. It's mentioned in chapter 16, but in chapter 19 is when the battle actually takes place, and they think it is in the location of a town named Megiddo, and that's where it gets Armageddon from that town name. But the interesting thing about this battle is that Jesus himself comes down and battles against all the forces of evil. And it says he battles the forces of evil with the sword that is his mouth. So I mean, you can leave it up to your imagination about what that means, but Jesus battles all the forces of evil. And it says that all of the faithful people who are with Jesus, they conquer not by joining in the battle and shedding blood. They conquer by just standing firm and not fighting on the side of evil. That is how they conquer. It's like nonviolent resistance, where they were letting Jesus do the battle for them. And that is a really important part of the Battle of Armageddon. The reason why I chose to have us do this whole teaching series on the book of Revelation is that I think most of us are familiar with Revelation probably only when we've come into contact with it if we've been walking down the street in a large city and we see a street preacher with a megaphone and maybe a sandwich board and maybe a Bible, and they're shouting out a few choice verses from Revelation, and they're telling everybody that they go to hell. That doesn't seem like a good way to teach Revelation, because this person is judging people based on no experience of what all the people around them have experienced in life. And they're just picking and choosing some verses to hurl at people. And in response, many people who are Christians think, well, I've lived my life long enough without ever cracking open the book of Revelation, so why start now? Apparently there's scary things in there that I just don't want to deal with. And what if I actually do open it up and it changes my vision that I have of God, or how I've always seen God? I don't think that's a good enough response. I think Revelation, yes, it has some scary parts in it. It has symbols that can be interpreted in multiple ways. It does have harsh things displayed in it. But there's also so much more than that. And when we open up the book of Revelation and allow ourselves to be disturbed and to be shaken by some of the visions that we see, we can also then begin to see where God shows up in the hardest situations of our lives and in the toughest situations in this world. I think when we finally do open up the book of Revelation, instead of it making us fearful, I think it can make us more faithful. We can cling to our God in deeper ways. That's why I think it's important to study this book. As we've been studying Revelation, we've entered into the complexity. There's so many contrasts in Revelation. There are battles between good and evil. And in between each battle scene, there is a scene of heavenly splendor where God's goodness is on display. As we go through Revelation, we've also seen warnings mixed with blessings and promises. They're both there. Even in the reading that I shared with you from Revelation 21, it had a beautiful vision of blessing and peace, but also talked about warnings as well. And if you were here for one of our first sermons, Pastor Taylor talked about how in the beginning of Revelation there are 7 letters written to 7 different churches within the Roman Empire. And each of these letters had a mixture of warning and blessing. There was more heavily based warnings for the churches that had become complacent, that had become ho-hum in their faith, ho-hum in how they care for others. There were warnings for people who had completely sold out in congregations that were now worshiping the empire rather than worshiping God. And then there was lots of blessings and promises given to the churches who were enduring hardship and who were trying to cling to their faith. And these letters were meant to encourage them. And Pastor Taylor put on the screen, what if there was an 8th letter? And it said, "Dear Good Shepherd." What would that letter say? Would there be warnings? Would there be blessings? Maybe a mixture of both. But both the warnings and the blessings were meant to spark our faith, to make us passionate about our God again. Another contrast in Revelation is how in Revelation our souls, our individual souls, are cared for by our God. But also God cares about how we act as communities, as collective groups of Christians who work together. God cares about both of these things. And so I want to share with you just a few examples of how I have seen God speaking through the themes of Revelation. The first time that I ever started thinking about Revelation more deeply was in 2009 when I went on a trip to Nicaragua. I was there with a group of Christians who were studying the connections between poverty and hunger and climate change, and looking at how communities who have the least wealth also are the most impacted by natural disasters, and wondering how we as Christians can partner with communities around the world that have experienced great suffering. And so we went to this community on the east coast of Nicaragua, just inland from the Atlantic Ocean. And it was 2009, and back in 2007, 2 years before our trip, this part of Nicaragua had been devastated by Hurricane Felix. And this was a very interesting event because no hurricane has ever been that far south in the Atlantic before. So this community never even thought of being hurricane ready because there had never been a hurricane ever in their history. So we went to learn about how they had been surviving since this hurricane. And as we walked through the village, it still looked just as devastated as it did probably right after the hurricane. And they took us as honored guests to their most important location in their village, their church, where they worship every week. And as we approached the church, I was struck by the fact that there was something missing. There is no roof on this church. It had been torn off in the hurricane, and yet they still were worshiping there each and every week, even though there was rebar sticking up out of the floor of the concrete. I mean, this was definitely not a safe place. This would not pass any safety inspection. There was no playground there. There were no donut balls in the outside courtyard area of the church, and yet they still managed to worship. There was no roof, and they still managed to worship in this place. There were only a few pews left in the church, and they let us as honored guests come and sit in the pews as they shared their stories with us. And I was struck by what I saw when I looked more closely at the mural behind the altar. It says in Spanish, "The Second Coming of Christ," and it is the final judgment scene from the book of Revelation. As I was staring at this, I thought, this is a horrible image. In it, you see the children who are of God who are sent off into one side, and the children of the devil being sent off into the other side. There's flames on one side and comfort on the other. And I thought, what an eerie and harsh and judgmental image that these folks are left with as they worship in this church without a roof. Then they started to share how this image gives them hope. They said they often feel like disposable humans. They had a very simple existence, and they did not have a lot of money, and yet what they did have was ripped away in that hurricane. And they could see how all of the fancy resorts along the coastlines were being rebuilt with lots of money, and yet they hadn't heard a word from their government or anyone else. It was hard for them. A lot of their young men had left that area to go find work elsewhere, and living was hard, but when they would gather for worship, they would see this promise that they had value to God, that God was going to come and comfort them, that God was going to make all things new, that God was going to put an end to death and mourning and crying and pain, and they were going to experience the promise that God would dwell with them and make them new. That's what they saw when they saw this mural on the wall. And I wonder if the words that came to them as they sang were, "Abide with me, falls fast the eventide. The darkness deepens, Lord, with me abide. When other helpers fail and comforts flee, help of the helpless, oh, abide with me." This helped me see Revelation in a new way. It helped me to focus my hope on God, not on my circumstances. And I could see that from my location of being someone who never had to worry where my next meal was coming from or if I would have a roof on my house. I could see this very differently than folks who had a very different situation. And yet, the call of Revelation is for all of us to put our hope in God. I think that reading through Revelation can also help us connect to where we see God in our own personal difficulties and tragedies. I was talking to someone recently who said that he was in a dark time in his life, and he didn't see any hope, and he didn't see any way forward. And he said that his marriage had fallen apart, his connection to his old church was completely shattered. He didn't know where God was, and he said he was thinking of pulling the trigger, literally on ending his own life. But somehow, he moved through that time and eventually was able to see God showing up in new ways. And he said that he was led to pull the trigger not on ending his life, but to pull the trigger on beginning anew. He was thinking about in Revelation where it says God is making a new heaven and a new earth. God is not making new things. God is making all things new. That means that God could even make him new in the completely shattered experience that he was living through. And he started seeing God showing up. And he found a connection here at this church. And he started to look at some of the things he had been through, and he'd found ways to work towards forgiveness in those areas in his life. That was powerful. He was seeing Revelation, the message of Revelation, in his life, in how God was making him new. And this became his prayer. I fear no foe, with thee at hand to bless. Ills have no weight, and tears no bitterness. Where is death's sting? Where grave thy victory? I triumph still if thou abide with me. This final vision in Revelation is an invitation for all of us to be a part of this party that God is going to throw for all time. The things not invited to the party are death, mourning, crying, and pain. What is at the party is the presence of God, is the repair of things that have been broken, is a fresh start for things that feel lost. That's what this new party is about. And one thing you may notice is there was these warnings about the cowardly and the faithless and the sorcerers and idolaters and fornicators and polluted and liars. Here's the thing. I think if we look at that list, we all find ourselves in that list somewhere. But this party is not for people who have never sinned. These are the people who realize that they are powerless to sin, and they need Jesus to fight for them, and they need Jesus to bring them to that fresh start. That's what the end of Revelation is inviting us to, helping us to realize that we can't save ourselves, but we have this God who has open arms, who is offering forgiveness. It makes me think of a final verse of a song that we all sing a lot, but we don't usually sing the 5th verse of it. When we've been there 10,000 years, bright shining as the sun, we've no less days to sing God's praise than when we first begun. That's what we're invited to. Amen.